Good evening. My name's Adam Tooze. I'm the director of the European Institute and professor in the history department here at Columbia. And it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to this book launch event for this elegant, beautiful, wonderful book, Jacques Schiffrin, a publisher in exile from Pléiade to Pantheon, by Amos Reichman, which is published this spring by Columbia University Press. The book tells the story of Jacques Schiffrin, the founder of Les Éditions de la Pléiade in Paris, and co-founder of Pantheon Books in New York, who fled Russia shortly before World War I, and later escaped Vichy's anti-Jewish laws during World War II, a story that we will tell this evening. It's my very great pleasure that we have with us this evening the author, Amos Reichman. He studied humanities at the École Normale Supérieure de Lyon, after which he received his agrégation in history. He is a historian by passion, I think it's fair to say. While at the ENS, he conducted research about the history of Jerusalem during World War II, and we were very fortunate to have him here on an exchange program from the ENS, which is when he began working on Jacques Schiffrin's archive here, and which led to the book that gathers us here this evening. After Columbia, Amos moved on to Sciences Po in Paris and then to the École Nationale d'Administration, the ENA, France's School of Government, from which he graduated 2 months ago, and with a certain degree of inevitability is now working in the French Ministry of Culture, trying to save France's newspaper system, so doing the Lord's work. We're absolutely delighted to have you back with us this evening. To discuss Amos's book, we are fortunate to have with us this evening a quite extraordinary group of panellists. Those of you who come to our events regularly know that we have good panels. This might be the best that I've ever presided over. It's certainly one of the largest, and you'll see that from my seating position now that I'm still here. First in our list of speakers will be Amos's translator. We're very, very glad to be able to have, I think, the person who rendered this book into English for us, Sandra Smith, who's the translator of 12 novels available in English by Irene Nemirovsky. And her translation of Nemirovsky's Suite Française won no less than 4 prizes in the US and the UK. Sandra also published a new translation of Camus' L'Étranger, The Outsider, and when you get the chance to read this book, you will savour her prose. It's really a delight to read this book, and a great pleasure to have translators who are such key figures in the transmission of culture around the world. She will be followed by Susan Rubin Suleiman, next to her on the panel here. C. Douglas Dillon, Professor of the Civilization of France and Professor of Comparative Literature at Harvard University. She works on 20th century French literature and culture, avant-garde movements, feminist theory, trauma and memory. She is the author and editor of dozens of books, Crises of Memory in the Second World War, 2006, Subversive Intent, Gender Politics and the Avant-Garde. But I think what is most pertinent is perhaps her most recent work. Amongst those, we should mention the Nemirovsky question, the life, death, and legacy of a Jewish writer in 20th century France, an intellectual biography of novelist Irene Nemirovsky, who was deported from France and died in Auschwitz in 1942, and whose novel Suite Française was translated by Sandra. She also told me, delightedly, that she was recently dubbed Chevalier de la Légion d'Honneur, only a matter of... And like I said, this was an extraordinary panel because sitting next to her is another member of that distinguished order. Perhaps we weren't quite sure about what your rank is at this point, but officier. So none other than Bob Paxton, Emeritus Mellon Professor of Social Sciences at Columbia University, a true legend of not just modern French but of modern European history. His books include Vichy France, Old Guard and New Order, 1940-1944, Vichy France and the Jews, and the Anatomy of Fascism. He was one of the first, or perhaps the first, in the 1960s and 70s to establish on the basis of German archives the active collaboration of Vichy France with Hitler's European designs. And in connection to our topic this evening, I would like to add that in 2009, Robert Paxton served as a guest curator for an exhibition in the New York Public Library entitled Between Collaboration and Resistance, French Literary Life Under Nazi Occupation. The next historian in our lineup is Eric Jennings, a distinguished professor of history of France and the Francophone world at the University of Toronto. He works on 19th and 20th century France, French colonialism and decolonisation, and amongst other books, he co-edited L'Empire colonial sous Vichy. His latest book is Escape from Vichy, the refugee exodus to the French Caribbean, which explores the experiences of some 5,000 refugees, including, for instance, Claude Lévi-Strauss and André Gide, who fled from France via the island of Martinique in late 1940 and 41, a truly fascinating extension of our understanding of the wartime diaspora. And I would like to seize the opportunity to say that the Maison Française and the European Institute will host tomorrow at 1 p.m. a talk with Eric Jennings about his new book, presumably right here in the same place. So please come back tomorrow. And then, finally, you may be looking along the panel and seeing a face which looks very familiar and perhaps was not on the poster, but it is indeed David Miliband, President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, which works to deliver humanitarian assistance in war-affected countries throughout the world and assist refugees who resettle to the United States. And the particular relevance of this is that at the origins of the IRC was the Emergency Rescue Committee, which Varian Frey represented in Marseille, which is what helped Jacques Schiffrin to escape from France in 1941. Before becoming president of the IRC, David had one of the most stellar careers in modern British politics, becoming, I believe, the youngest foreign secretary in the history of Britain, serving between 2007 and 2010, and he recently published a book, Rescue, Refugees and the Political Crisis of Our Time. So many thanks to this wonderful group of panellists for being with us this evening to discuss Amos Reichman's book. This book tells a story of literary life in interwar Paris and a story of rescue and exile, and it's also the story of a family who went through these momentous events. And I would like to say how grateful we are to Jacques Schiffrin's family, and in particular to name Lena Schiffrin and our colleague Anya Schiffrin and Joseph Stiglitz at the front here, for their constant support to Amos Reichman's research project, which has now become this book that we are celebrating today, and also for their friendship for the European Institute and your support for so many of our endeavours over the years. It's been truly a privilege for my institute and the Maison Française, together with the Department of History and Columbia University Press, to partner with Anya Schiffrin in the organisation of this book launch. I'll start the panel. We're broadly speaking going to go in the order that you have them here. I'll ask Amos to start us off, but before I do that, please join me in welcoming this extraordinary group to come.
Thank you very much, Adam, for this presentation. I'd like to thank Columbia University, the Maison Française, for organizing this event, and once again, thank you very much, Anya and Lena, for all what you did in order to make this book and this moment happen. I'd like to emphasize that there is a gap between how, on the one hand, on the public scene, the achievements of Jacques Schiffrin are so well known, while on the other hand, his name remains more confidential. In France, La Pléiade is part of our identity, of our imagination. It could be considered as what the historian Pierre Nora once called a lieu de mémoire, a part of our common identity. However, if you ask in France who was the founder of the Pléiade, no one, except some very few specialists, could give you the answer. Of course, some people can tell you that the Pléiade is owned by Gallimard, but the name of Jacques Schiffrin remains more confidential. Here also, the name of Pantheon Books is very well known, but the one of Jacques Schiffrin is not on the front line. I think one of the main reasons of this paradox is that Jacques Schiffrin's destiny was torn apart, modified, by a history that didn't allow him to consolidate his status in one place. Even though he, as a professional, always follows the same path, prioritizing quality over quantity, publishing great, beautiful books, as a human being, he doesn't only witness the upheavals of history, but he undergoes them, and this had tragic repercussions over his life. I don't want to be too long, but since maybe you didn't have time yet to read the book, and I hope you will, I'd like to sum up briefly Jacques Schiffrin's life. Jacques Schiffrin was born in 1892 in the Russian Empire in Baku, a city where his father, Savelli, came in order to work in the flourishing oil industry that was rising at the time on the Caspian Sea. just before the First World War, Jacques Schiffrin moved to Geneva, where he studied law. Therefore, he went and he followed his European education in Monte Carlo and then in Florence, where he was the assistant of a very important art historian, Bernard Berenson. In Florence, Jacques Schiffrin was also the Russian teacher, actually, of an American art specialist that was in the city of the Medici at the time, and her name was Peggy Guggenheim. In the meantime, the Soviet Revolution has won and has nationalized Jacques Schiffrin's father's petrochemical industry company. Jacques Schiffrin didn't agree with the communist ideology and had therefore no reason to come back to the country where he was born. In the beginning of the 20s, it is in France, and in Paris more precisely, that he decided to stay and to stop. First, he worked with a publisher of art books, Henri Piazza, and in 1922, it is by his own that he decided to launch the project of his life, La Pléiade. The goal of Schiffrin was simple, giving to as many people as possible the opportunity to have access to the greatest works of world literature in a very easy and manageable format at a cost really kind of not very expensive. And he began with Russian classics that he translated with his friends, and there were illustrations of Russian artists exiled in Paris at the time. It was such a success that 10 years after, in 1933, Gallimard, who has become in less than 15 years the most important publisher in Paris, decided to reach a deal with Schiffrin. He decided to buy the Pléiade, and in exchange, Jacques Schiffrin was allowed to stay at the head of the collection. In Paris, Schiffrin's personal life also changed. After a first wedding in 1922 with a pianist named Yura Guller, he divorced and then remarried in 1929 with Simone Heyman. Together, they will have a son, and some of you knew really well. This book is dedicated to his memory, André Gide, who was born in 1935. We also have to notice that in 1927, Jacques Schiffrin has become a French citizen. He has been naturalized. Nevertheless, despite all these achievements, Jacques Schiffrin remains a migrant. He was a French citizen, but a Russian in exile. And even though he was not very involved in religion, he remained a Jew. Schiffrin's life definitely changed when the Germans took Paris in June 1940 and Marshal Pétain became the head of the French state. Schiffrin and his family found a shelter in Normandy, and it is there that Jacques Schiffrin received a tragic letter, 4 lines, very administrative, very concise, written by Gaston Gallimard. In this letter that Schiffrin received in November 1940, Gallimard told him that he was no longer part of the publishing house. Why so? Because Gaston Gallimard accepted the conditions of the Nazi, that is to say, if you want to continue to publish, you have to fire all the Jews of your publishing house. This letter marks the beginning of a tragic odyssey for Jacques Schiffrin. He had therefore no choice but to leave France. Him, who had already left his native country, had therefore to leave the country he had chosen. Schiffrin and his family crossed the demarcation line and went to the south of France, Saint-Tropez and then Marseille, and with the help of his closest friend, André Gide, who contacted Varian Fry, who was at the head of the emergency rescue committee, he found a place on a boat that was leaving Marseille to New York in May 1941. When I worked on Jacques Schiffrin, he made me think of a figure highlighted by Albert Camus that will be published by Jacques Schiffrin here in America a few years later. The figure is the one of Sisyphus, because even so when you could imagine that he reached the top of the mountain, that he succeeded, he had to start everything all over again. And the boat that left Marseille in May 1941 never reached, actually, New York. He had to stop in Casablanca, where the family had to stay 3 months without knowing if they would be able one day to reach the New World, in a kind of a purgatory, because they were already far from Europe. They had already crossed the Straits of Gibraltar, but they were so far from the New World. And so it was another very difficult period for Jacques Schiffrin, and this time with the help of André Gide, once again, but a publisher based in Barcelona, Gustavo Gili. He found a place on a new boat, the Ciudad de Sevilla, that left Casablanca in August 1941. André Schiffrin remembered that Jacques Schiffrin was with the other men in this boat, packed as a beast in terrible conditions. But finally, on August the 20th of 1941, Jacques Schiffrin arrived in New York, and that very same day in Paris, more than 4,000 Jews were arrested. In New York, Schiffrin had to start everything all over again. He had to learn a new language, a new culture, to build new friendships. And after 2 difficult first years, Schiffrin in 1943 decided to found a new publishing house called Jacques Schiffrin & Co., publishing books in French for a French audience, mostly exiled in New York at the time. And he decided to publish books with that embodies the spirit of resistance. In 1944, Jacques Schiffrin joined another exile, this time from Germany, Kurt Wolff, that had founded Pantheon Books in New York, and together they will try to bring this ideal of a classical European culture to the United States, and they participated to what we call the translator study between old Europe and the United States. There is here a kind of final paradox in Jacques Schiffrin's life. While he began to find his place in the United States, the war was ending in Europe, and he had opportunities to come back to France, but he didn't. First, he was sick due to an emphysema, a lungs disease, that he contracted during the first months of the war, during the Funny War, when he served in the French army. But more broadly, I think that he just didn't want to come back to the country that has betrayed him, and he didn't want to work again for the Gallimards that sent him on the tragic roads of exile at the beginning of the war. After the war, I think that in New York, Schiffrin could appear as a sleepwalker, to use the title of a book he will publish in New York by Hermann Broch. He was here in the United States, but he was looking with nostalgia on what his son André would call a lost paradise. And it is not fortunate that Schiffrin, in his correspondence, wrote that he was actually killed in Montoire when Marshal Pétain met Adolf Hitler and began the collaboration, and it was exactly 2 weeks before Schiffrin received this tragic letter from Gaston Gallimard. In 1950, Jacques Schiffrin died in New York. He never went back to Europe, but his son André did in a very important journey in 1949. But Schiffrin didn't come back to Europe since that day of 1941 in Marseille, when going on that boat that would take him to Casablanca, he heard a crowd of dock workers yelling anti-Semitic insults at him and his family, and this would be the last song that Jacques Schiffrin would hear from this Europe that he loved so much. So these are the main events of Jacques Schiffrin.
Sandra, if you would like to give us a few words about your experience of translating this book.
Yes, well, it was a very interesting experience for me because normally I only translate fiction. And when Anja Schiffrin contacted me about the possibility of translating the book, it was really, as she explained it to me, for her family, because it was important to her as part of her family's history. So I read it and I liked it and I thought, yes, this would be a nice thing to do. And seeing Anja and her family here tonight, it's very gratifying, and I'm very happy that I was privileged enough to be involved in the process. The original translation was, as was mentioned before, a thesis that Amos had written about Jacques Schiffrin's life, and it contained, these are my only notes, 507 footnotes. Now, an academic thesis is not really a book. A lot of people write their theses and then hope to turn them into books, and a lot of people do succeed in that. When we had finished the original translation, Annie and I had a really interesting conversation where we discussed possibly having an editor turn the thesis into a biography, because they are really two different animals, as it were. So basically I agreed to take it on, and I learned a lot about it. I learned a lot about being an editor, which was new to me. I had worked with editors, and I've been fortunate because I've had a lot of good editors with whom I've had very, very good relationships, which is not always the case with translations. I've been very lucky. But also, Amos and I worked together because I felt that out of respect for his work, it was his work I was dealing with, that I didn't want to change anything or omit anything without his permission. And so we did work together on it.
It was great pleasure.
And it was good fun. And we did emails back and forth. We met once in Paris as well, which was very nice. So we managed to get it down to 388 footnotes, which the editors here at Columbia very cleverly have arranged so that they're not intrusive at all, but they're all at the back, and each section has its own little set of footnotes, so you don't really notice so much. But for a translator, it's very difficult when you need the information. Sometimes that happens in a footnote, but you don't want the distraction of a footnote. So that was the biggest challenge for me, because I had to find a way of incorporating some of the information in the footnote directly into the text, which is what we did really, and that's how we managed to condense it. So it was a very interesting experience for me, and I'm very happy to have been part of it. So that was my role in the book, and it's very, very nice to see it as a book.
Okay. Well, I guess the first thing I should say is that I really learned a lot by reading Amos's book. I was very happy to learn so much. Because you're right, Jacques Schiffrin thing is not a household name. And I should also say that I'm very happy to be here because I knew André Gide and had great respect for him. And saw him not that long before, saw him in Paris not that long before he died. So I'm very glad to see the family here and happy to participate in this event. And so we've been given a little assignment, and my assignment is to talk about Jacques Schiffrin and the literary scene between the two world wars. Okay. A young Russian immigrant from a secular, well-to-do Jewish family, where the father was a self-made man, arrived in Paris around 1919-1920, rejecting the Bolshevik Revolution, and creates a brilliant career in the literary world of the 1920s and 1930s, but then falls victim to Vichy anti-Semitism and the Nazi occupation of France. How could I avoid thinking of Irina Nemirovsky, who I told you I wrote a book on, while reading, and of course Sandra has translated, while reading Amos's book about Jacques Schiffrin's life. Everything I've just said about him also applies to her. Young, secular Jewish family, etc., etc. There were, of course, major differences between them. He was 11 years older than she. She was a writer. He was an editor and publisher, though he also translated. They moved in different literary circles. He with what I call the moderate modernists, in other words, not the avant-garde, but the established modernists of Gallimard and the Nouvelle Revue Française. She with the more conservative académiciens, members of the Académie Française, and Albert Michel and the Revue des Deux Mondes. He became a French citizen early in 1927, and that was a huge difference actually between them, and was able, with difficulty, to leave France in 1941 and find a haven in New York while she was deported as a foreign Jew in 1942 and died in Auschwitz. But I bet that they had some Russian friends in common. even if they didn't mingle much. And I would really give a lot to know whether they ever met. I just feel that they must have. His brother Simon was a film producer, as was the brother-in-law of Ivan Nemirovsky. And the circles of Russian Jewish emigres in Paris who came from the middle or upper classes were not that many, and I'm sure they overlapped. So cela fait rêver, as the French say. One dreams about this. But let's talk now about Schiffrin's literary circle between the two world wars. The two most distinguished members of this circle, André Gide and Roger Martin Dugard, were among his closest friends, French friends. And their friendships were cemented by Russian literature. In 1922, when he was just starting out, Jacques Schiffrin helped Gide translate Pushkin. Actually, what he did was he translated the text literally, Queen of Spades, and then Gide turned it into good French. And it was actually also the first book that Schiffrin published in the Éditions de la Pléiade a year later. That was the beginning of their lasting friendship. To say that is to say a lot, because at that time, André Gide was at the height of his fame. He was one of the most respected, if not the most respected, French writer of the time, the author of Les Nourritures Terrestres, L'Immoraliste, La Porte Étroite, Les Cartes du Vatican, and many, many other books. Now, having him as a friend and supporter was a huge piece of good fortune. I was happy to learn from Amos's book that just how important a role Gide played in Jacques Schiffrin's life during the war, helping him and his family leave France in the chaotic days after Jacques lost his job at Gallimard. And as we know, Gaston Gallimard did not behave like that. Without Gide's help, no Varian Fry, no emergency rescue committee for Jacques Schiffrin, no money for the tickets on the ship to New York. And Gide, I would say, really behaved like a mensch in this instance, even though he had no particular fondness for Jews, as we know from his diary. And I can't, refrain from saying one of the stunning pieces of information I learned from the book was that after Jacques Schiffrin's death in 1950, he met the Franco-American or whatever, Julien Gris, who was both French and American. And Julien Gris noted in his diary, quote, that Gide told him, he, that is Jacques Schiffrin, was the only Jew I held in my affection. That's it. People are complicated, but despite his anti-Semitism, he behaved so well. And he not only helped and supported Jacques Schiffrin in France before the war and then helped him to leave France, but he continued to support him after the Schiffrin's emigration. How? Well, his Interview Imaginaire was the first book published by Jacques Schiffrin and Company in around 1943. And he made Schiffrin his exclusive representative in North and South America, which was huge. I mean, he was like a giant of the time. Now, as for Roger Martin Dugard, who was a good friend of Gide, Jacques Schiffrin also cemented his friendship with him via Russian literature. They translated Tolstoy's War and Peace together, and they planned to translate Chekhov together. Incidentally, those two writers were Ivan Nemirovsky's favorite writers, at least among the Russians. Now, in 1937, Roger Martin Dugard was awarded the Nobel Prize for his masterpiece novel, Les Thibault, multi-volume novel, Les Thibault, which Albert Camus, among others, greatly admired. He called Martin Dugard the greatest 19th century novelist of the 20th century. and actually, that was a compliment. Les Thibault is a really great 19th century novel in the 20th century mode. A realist novel about a family. And Martin Dugard also offered help to Jacques Schiffrin during the anguished days and months that he and Simone and their son André spent while waiting to leave France and then Casablanca. He wrote encouraging letters to Jacques, telling him to keep his faith and not abandon hope. While not as concrete as Gide's help, Martin Dugas' letters must have meant a great deal to this man who had reached the pinnacle of the literary world, only to see himself rejected and hounded as a Jew. So that's that.
Gaston Galima's letter to Jacques Schiffrin has been alluded to. I want to read it. It's worth hearing in its entirety. I'll read it in French and I'll read it in English. Monsieur, very good, not cher, monsieur, réorganisant sur des bases nouvelles notre maison d'édition, je dois renoncer à votre collaboration à la fabrication de la collection Bibliothèque de la Pléiade. Il est entendu que votre compte sera réglé selon les termes de notre contrat. Veuillez croire, monsieur, à mes sentiments distingués. Gaston Galima, administrateur délégué. Well, reorganizing our publishing house on a new basis. I must give up your participation in publishing the Bibliothèque de la Pléiade. Of course, our accounts will be settled according to our contract, yours truly. Now, this is not an isolated action. What is going on simultaneously in both the occupied and the unoccupied zone of France is that Jewish businesses and Jewish enterprises are being confiscated. That's the only word for it, only because there was sort of a legal language to seem to disguise the fact, but it's confiscation. The Germans began with an ordinance on the 27th of September saying that a yellow label, a yellow sign must be placed on the front of every Jewish business, and then they went on October the 18th to decree that a trustee, administrateur provisoire, trustee, must be named to head all Jewish enterprises. Income from the enterprise wouldn't go to the owner, it would go into a closed bank account as well. This is confiscation. Now, the Vichy government is doing its best to outdo the Germans at doing the same thing. There's a kind of struggle in Vichy France to have their sovereignty recognized in the whole country. They really thought that if they could do the job better than the Germans might repeal their own ordinances and let the Vichy ordinances stand. So similarly, the Vichy government appointed trustees of confiscated Jewish property. I suppose one might imagine the Éditions de la Pléiade, but the German trustee, this obviously terrified Gaston Galima, and he was happy to buy himself out of this by letting Jacques Schiffrin go. Now, what about the unoccupied zone? Might not he have gone across into the Vichy zone and gotten a somewhat better treatment? Absolutely not. As I say, the Vichy government had its own ordinances removing Jewish owners from the direction of them. And if Jacques Schiffrin had not become a citizen, he could have been interned in a camp because Jews of foreign nationality, according to a law of the 4th of October 1940, could be put into a camp at the prefect's initiative. And so, to sum up, the situation of Jacques Schiffrin at the end of 1940, beginning of 1941, in France, was that neither zone offered him the slightest possibility, and he had no alternative but to try to escape, which brings us to the purview of Henry Jennings.
Thank you. It's an honor to be part of this panel and to speak after Robert Paxton. So you just heard the general context. I want to very quickly speak about how this escape was even possible. How did he get on a boat? Why was this boat still around? And that's the subject of my latest book. And I want to say that in this regard, what you described as re-immigration, and that's what Varian Fry described it as. This was re-immigration. Most of the people on board the boats to the Caribbean and then on to New York were people who had found themselves in France because they'd fled either Stalin or Hitler, and Franco in many cases, Mussolini in a number of other cases, found themselves in France, which incidentally had become the #1 host for international refugees in the 1930s, found themselves trapped after France's defeat and needed to get out. And so what you see, and I think that the book makes this very plain, is that various organizations, various networks, various friendships came into play. And this is certainly the case of Jacques Schiffrin's story. But what I want to stress is that this myriad of organizations that include the Red Cross, the Joint Distribution Committee, the Quakers, Varian Fry's Emergency Rescue Organization, many others, weren't, well, they were all working for this rescue of these refugees, but that there is also a broader context. And the context is, amazingly, there were still shipping lines. So it was possible to get out of Dodge. And why would you want to get out of Dodge? Well, Robert Paxton just alluded to it. There was a so-called auto list. There was a list of people who could at any moment be handed over to the Germans by Vichy, because this was one of the least honorable clauses of a very dishonorable armistice, the surrender on demand clause. If Germany wanted any German or Austrian national, even in the so-called free or southern zone of France, Vichy had to hand them over. Various Jewish foreigners were being interned, various communist foreigners were being interned, various Spanish Republicans were being interned, but also Vichy was denaturalizing hand over fist Jewish people who had become French and had that as a rampart, as a safety. So there were many reasons to get out. So where did you get out? Well, Lisbon was one of the many routes that existed. Casablanca was another. What I want to suggest, and this is the topic of my book, so I'll talk more about this tomorrow, is that the Martinique corridor was actually quite sizable. It lasted until the fall of from the fall of France in June 1940 through to June 1941. And in this case, Jacques Schiffrin is incredibly lucky, or at least his escape was incredibly timely, because he literally got on the last boat. He got on the Wyoming. So these boats were not, don't imagine passenger liners, cruise liners, these were cargo mix. These were transport vessels that had brought oranges. And as Amos just told us, conditions on board were so dreadful that many of the people who were being rescued and paid a fortune to get out wondered whether this really was rescue or was it a form of expulsion. And that really is at the heart of my book, where I suggest that really this was both. Turns out that the boats to Martinique were allowed to leave on order of one of Vichy's early interior ministers, Marcel Pérouton, who in a directive that I uncovered in the archives made it very clear that he wished people who were in danger to leave France for humanitarian reasons, but also because they represented, quote, unnecessary mouths to feed, that they were parasites, as it were. And it's this bizarre and ambiguous mix of expulsion and rescue that makes it possible for about 5,000 people, the most famous of whom were people like Jacques Schiffrin, but also André Gide, André Breton, Claude Lévi-Strauss, Wilfred Hollande, to make it out at the last minute. Final point, he was lucky in that he got out to the safety. Basically, once you got to the other side of the Mediterranean, the odds of being sent back were very slim. He had hoped to get to Martinique and then on from there directly to New York. This was not to be. It was not to be, in part because of what happened on the other side of the Atlantic. The United States was making it extraordinarily hard for refugees to get asylum here. Maybe as a Canadian, I'm more uniquely placed to talk about this. But in any event, the conditions were getting harsher and harsher. Robert Paxton knows this better than I do. By the time of May 1941, one required 2 signed declarations by Americans who were willing to vouch for refugees, but not just vouch for them, say that they would pay for their survival in this country if they became a burden on the state. It was getting much harder. By the middle of 1941, anybody who had any family in an occupied part of Europe was deemed suspect by the State Department. In other words, the gates of the New World, not just the US, but also Cuba, Canada, Argentina, were starting to shut one by one. Martinique was part of Vichy France, and so it remained a possibility. And in that sense, again, it's this very ambiguous departure. So what happened in May, June 1941 is one of these many cargoes, and there were about 20, was steaming along quietly towards Martinique when US intelligence went out saying, quote, steamer headed to Martinique probably contains Gestapo agents on board, intercept. And the forces that intercepted the boat were actually the Free Dutch, the Dutch who had their navy in cahoots with the British and the Americans. Well, the British at this point, because we're before the American intervention in the war. And the Dutch intercept this ship, bring it to Trinidad, interrogate everyone on board. And it turns out that the only Gestapo agents on board were fictional. That what the Americans had been alerted to was a bunch of German-speaking Jewish people on board these boats. But what could be read as a comedy actually turned out to be a tragedy, because it shut down the route. Vichy became hypersensitive, the Germans became hypersensitive, and certainly Washington became hypersensitive. And so the route, unfortunately, tragically closed. And so in that sense as well, Jacques Schiffrin's story is important because it's part of the ending of one of the last exits out of occupied Britain. Thank you.
So the good news is that it's the last speaker, so you can all breathe a sigh of relief. I'm really very honoured to be here this evening, and thank you very much for the invitation. My assignment from Professor Tooze was to listen to the preceding contributions and then provide a sweeping commentary that picked up points from each of them and gave you food for thought for your questions. So I wanted to start where Professor Jennings ended up, because the origins of what was the Emergency Rescue Committee and became the International Rescue Committee, which I'm the president of today, the origins are actually not in Europe, but here in the United States, because in 1933, Albert Einstein was in New York when Hitler came to power, and he saw the doors closing here in the United States. And Einstein became increasingly agitated about the fact that so many of his friends, relatives were trapped in what became occupied Europe. There are some extraordinary letters that he wrote to Eleanor Roosevelt in 1940, 1941, begging her to persuade her husband, Franklin Roosevelt, to let in Europe's Jews to the United States. And the answer was no, we can't do this. And so in a fit of anger, really, Einstein recruited 50 of his friends and set up the International Rescue Committee, effectively joined it with the Emergency Rescue Committee, and its first mission was to send Varian Fry to Marseille, to occupy France. He set up a safe house there called the Airbell House, and it was from there that 2,000 fake passports were issued and that people like Jacques Schiffrin were rescued from occupied France. Parentheses, in rather Einsteinian terms, there was a particular value placed on rescuing intellectuals, so it wasn't the most egalitarian rescue mission that has ever been launched. So the first thing is the origins were over here. Secondly, Varian Fry was obviously an absolutely extraordinary person. He went to France originally as a New York Times journalist, one of many things to thank the New York Times for, and then he became, he wasn't sent, he knew about the crisis, but it was only when he arrived that he became fully engaged with the traumatic human stories and the number of people who were involved, and it was that sense of entrepreneurial fury that drove him to use his accreditation from the Emergency Rescue Committee to start the work with the underground and with others to get people out. And I just want to pick out one thing that from the, I freely confess I learned as a student to pretend that you'd read the whole book, but I haven't read the whole book, but I did read part of the book that relates to the relationship between Fry and Jacques Schiffrin. And there's one point I just want to pick out because I think it's got some contemporary relevance. And Amos, you used the word torture, quote unquote, to describe the state of mind of Jacques Schiffrin about his escape. And I just think it's worth pausing for a minute to recognize that in the midst of any refugee crisis, you have this extraordinary courage, instinct, intellect that comes into play, but there's also trauma that's associated with it, and you don't, in the passage of the book that I read, you don't hide at all that was the trauma that was associated with the passage out of occupied France of Jacques Schiffrin, and that seemed to me to be very resonant with what we see around the world today. That's just the third thing I just want to mention, that the small organisation that Varian Fry was the first representative of in occupied France is today an international humanitarian organisation. We have 12,000 employees and 15,000 volunteers and 190 field sites in 40 countries around the world. and I'm delighted to say that we honour the heritage that we inherit from Baron Fry in 25 US cities, where we're now the largest refugee resettlement agency in the United States. Those of you who have opened a newspaper in the last 2 years will know that the number of refugees who are being allowed into the United States has been catastrophically reduced by the Trump administration from an average of about 90,000 a year to only 22,000 last year. So the number of refugees being allowed in, I'm very proud that we managed to keep up our 25 offices around the US. We've only had to close 3 so far. I was in San Diego last week meeting some Iraqis and some who had arrived last year, at the end of last year, and now opened a bakery. They were bakers from Baghdad who have now opened a bakery in San Diego. So the small sapling that was planted by Einstein and Baron Fry is now a large and significant player on the international humanitarian scene, but we are needed more than ever. And it's maybe ironic, we've had to open branches back in Europe. So now IRC is working in Greece, it's working in Serbia, it's also working, doubly ironically, in Germany. Germany, the most open country to refugees and asylum seekers, at least over the last 3 or 4 years. We're working to help kids get into German schools and socialize in German schools, and also help refugee adults find work using the lessons from here in the US. Let me just finish on a final point, which speaks to the responsibilities of people of my generation. My generation knew Holocaust survivors, but will outlive the Holocaust generation. Both my parents actually were refugees, my dad from Belgium in 1940, my mum from Poland in 1946. And I think that one of the opportunities that's presented by books like this, Amos is half my age, so he's not quite the transitional generation, but one of the opportunities that's afforded by books like this is for the transitional generation that didn't know the survivors of the Holocaust to fulfill our responsibility, which is to make sure that we tell their stories. And it's extraordinary in some ways that anti-Semitism should be on the rise today, but that seems to me to make it doubly important that we fulfill the responsibility of telling that story. I run a secular organization. Einstein didn't set up a Jewish organization, he set up a secular organization. And probably 40–45% of the people we help today are in Muslim-majority countries. But that generation that did know Holocaust survivors seemed to me to have a special responsibility to make sure that the truth about what happened is not lost and that the lessons are properly learned. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, it's not often that you have a panel this rich and this disciplined. It's quite extraordinary. Really a great thanks is owed to you, because it does give us space for a discussion with this wonderful audience that we have here. It also gives me a little room to abuse my privilege as chair, to just ask Amos perhaps to expand on one aspect of the story that I just was really curious about. And it's really to do with the sort of the life of the mind of Jacques Schiffrin's how he came to terms with this shock. I mean, you described him as a man with a mission to bring Western civilization or classical culture to the modern world in the 1930s. I mean, he's not the only person struggling with this question of its relevance in the interwar epoch, of its relevance in modernity. And the war, as you described it, was obviously a shattering blow to him personally, but also for many people of that generation, to that entire project. I mean, the figure that I know best, who is most comparable, is somebody like Hannah Arendt. And we know, and she lived through an experience of migration as a non-French German Jew who was even more endangered. She was actually in a camp. And we know how profound her reflections became, both on the issues of totalitarianism and modernity, and of course on the crucial issue of the right to have rights, the state of the statelessness, of the stateless, which is the sort of legal philosophical condition into which the refugees fall. So I'm kind of curious about how Schiffrin processed it in that sense, at the level of intellectual coming to terms. How is his publishing project in the United States different from the one that he embarked on? You commented on the emotion of not wanting to return to Europe, but what else moves in him as a result of this shock?
I think that in the case of Jacques Schiffrin, it is maybe less in his professional life that we can see the consequences of this shock than in a more intimate aspects of, for instance, his correspondence, his relationships with other people in exile in the United States or that stayed in France. Because finally, on a professional level, he mostly always did the same thing, that is to say, producing books that made like that decided to promote a kind of classic quality, and he was not really concerned by just making money, you know, and that was not the case. And so he followed this where in the United States as he did in France. But on a more personal level, we can see that he lost something by living in France, and he lost something that was not just a comfort, but maybe a belief in what is it to be a man in a country, in a civilization, and at one point there is something definitely broken. And I think that these intellectuals that you evoked, Martin Dugard, André Gide, they didn't fully understand this, because in the correspondence we can see that they say, come on Jacques, don't be so sad, take it easy. They said things, for instance, at one point, Roger Martin Dugard said to Jacques Schiffrin, your nostalgia is pathetic. But you cannot, for him, it was...
Well, but pathétique does not mean the same thing in English as in French. I mean, like if you say to somebody, your nostalgia is pathetic, it's like a put down of, hey, who do you think you are? But pathétique in French is different.
It's more like pathos.
What?
It's more like pathos. So your nostalgia is filled with pathos. Yeah.
Yes, but in French there is also a connotation of pathetic, which is negative. I mean, which says that you should not. I mean, why do you annoy us with this? There is also this dimension in French.
Yeah, I think you meant emotional. That your depression is emotional. In other words, if you use your reason, and you'll realize you don't need to feel so depressed. Well, obviously, that's saying to somebody, so stop feeling depressed.
But they also did not realize the gravity of the situation. In Amos's research, he quotes letters where Gide and Martin Dugard say to Schiffrin, oh, well, you know, you're exaggerating, it's not that serious, you know, it's not really a matter of life and death, but Schiffrin knew it was.
Regarding the point you raised about Hannah Arendt, it's very interesting because Hannah Arendt and Jacques Schiffrin knew each other in New York. André Schiffrin remembered that Hannah Arendt in New York gave him lessons of philosophy, and that she had the vocation, the flame that the great philosopher she was, and giving lessons to André, and she wrote this very beautiful books called We Refugees, where she says that the status of refugees changed with the Jews during World War II, because the concept of refugee before this generation, before these people, concerned people who, because of their political opinions, because of what they did, had to change and to live in another country. Whereas here, it's just for what they were that they had to change country. And Hannah Arendt said that arriving in the United States with these other refugees, they just wanted to do as if life should go on, you know, the show must go on. And she says that people have projects, so we need to. And at one point she said that at night, you know, the mask is falling. And she says, I don't know which memories and which thoughts nightly dwell in our dreams. I dare not ask for information, since I too had rather be an optimist. But sometimes I imagine that at least nightly we think of our dead, or we remember the poems we once loved. So I think on an intimate level, this there was something definitely broken here in Arendt's words, but also in Schiffrin's.
Well, absolutely, and then I think exactly that quote brings out a very interesting thing I also wanted to ask you about, which is his relationship to language. This is presumably his third or fourth, or God knows how many languages, but he's now all of a sudden had to live in English. And when Arendt was asked once about the experience of writing in English, she said, well, you know, like in Arendt's style, of course, you know, cigarette in hand, like, of course I can write in English, but you have to understand that I have in my mind the entire canon of German poetry. That's what that reference to poems. Like Arendt grew up reciting the canon of German poetry from memory. So when she writes and speaks German, everything is resonating against that lyrical backdrop, which she doesn't have in English. And that for her, it's not a question of grammar or typos and whatever. It's the fact that it just doesn't have that resonance. So how does Schiffrin negotiate this shift in language?
Well, so Schiffrin was born in a Russian language environment, then he learned Italian first when he was in Florence, then French, but when he arrived in the United States, he didn't speak a damn word, sorry for the of English, and André neither actually. André, first they lived in a hotel in the Upper East, the Adams Hotel, and they were living at the third floor. And André, in order to reach this floor and to say to the doorman that he wanted to go to the third floor, he learned by heart two French words, cerise, cherry, and prise, plug, and repeating cerise, prise, it was free please, and so he had the opportunity to reach this third floor. But regarding Jacques, he did these efforts that other French exiles didn't try to achieve, that is to say, to learn English. Other exiles in the United States from France, they stayed together, and they didn't try to learn English. And at the end of the war, most of these French exiles, they came back to France. But Jacques, he was more with the German, maybe because he was Jew, and so for instance, he lived mostly in the Upper West Side, whereas the other, the French exile lived in the Upper East. But for him, since the beginning, I think that returning to France was not really an option, because it was not something, an administrative moment of his life. It was too deep. And this is why he finally decided to learn this new language, and at the end of his life, you can see in his correspondence that he is writing fluently in English with other actors. So it's a very important issue, but he was still rereading sometimes in French, in Russian, the classics that he loved so much. So still he was looking to this lost paradise that was in his background.
You can see how fascinating this topic is. Can we have some questions from the audience? Yes, Andreas.
I have a question for Amos and perhaps...
Maybe you could say who you are when we ask questions.
Andreas Jussen, formerly professor at Columbia, now emeritus. But my question concerns the trip of the family from Paris, from the German-occupied zone into the Vichy zone. Now we know that this was extremely traumatic for many people. And what I have in mind here is an absolutely wonderful novel by a Jewish German exile writer, Anna Segers, called Transit, which is a fascinating text. It resonates with Nemirovsky as well. And I wonder whether you can say more about the days in which they moved from Paris south, and whether there are stories there that might be told in your book.
Well, regarding these precise elements, you can find information in the autobiography written by André Gide, Aller-retour en français, in French, a political education in English, where André remembered, so it's very interesting because he's writing this when he is an adult, but he remembers his eyes of a little children. He was just 5 years old, and so he remembered that he had to learn by heart a new identity, because in order to cross this demarcation line, they couldn't have this Jewish name, and I didn't unfortunately find in the archives what was this new identity, but this was part of this traumatic experience to have to change your name in order to cross a line.
And if I could just add something on Anna Sega's crossing the line. I know from her son, Pierre Radvani, that they crossed in a farmer's field that was astride. Basically, the demarcation line was this new border that was just drawn up. And so they managed to bribe a farmer whose field happened to be on both sides. So, and that was not uncommon as a strategy.
May I just add one thing? This novel by Anna Sega's, Transit, has been made into a movie which is just about to start showing in New York. I'm not sure whether it's already in the cinema.
It is.
It is, so
Yeah, it's very difficult, having seen the film, not to think of it reading this book. It's an incredible kind of source of resonance.
Can I ask a question of Adrian? Do you know whether Jacques Schiffrin registered as a Jew there was this, it was a German ordinance, right?
Yes.
Which demanded or required that all Jews in the occupied zone go to the police station and register and get an identity card as a Jew. And this was the forerunner to all the deportations, because once they were registered, then they were, arrestable. I think like 90% of the Jews in France, including many old families and established Jews, did register. And I assume, did Jacques Schiffrin register? A few people had the good sense not to, but very few. Right? I mean, very few. Yeah.
Most people registered having faith in the French state and fearing being
On the wrong side of the law.
you probably don't know.
I think he didn't, but maybe for chronological reasons that maybe Professor Paxton would explain better than me. He crossed the demarcation line by the end of 1940, so maybe
Yes,
this
but
might be...
there was still the German requirement predated.
It was October.
August 27th, I believe, of 1940 in the occupied zone. Now it's later in the unoccupied zone. So the time.
Curious. He must have if he registered, he would have a fiche.
Yes, but according to my researches, he didn't, but after...
Question at the back, gentleman at the back.
Hello, I'm Guillaume Derby. I'm a French philosophy student and close friends to Amos Reichman. And the text you mentioned from Hannah Arendt, she's writing at the beginning, if I remember well, that when she arrived, they were told to forget at first. And can't we think that in a way, in a poetic way, the work of Schiffrin in the United States is a sort of an act of resistance to this devaluation of the memory that happened at the beginning for the refugees?
Maybe someone wants to answer. My answer is yes, but maybe you want to as well.
What was the question?
So actually, yeah, I think that definitely the fact of publishing books from this European world that he knew so well was an act of resistance. And more precisely, Schiffrin decided to publish books in the United States that embodied this spirit of resistance. He published Vercors, Le Silence de la Mer, he published Kessel, L'Armée des Ombres, he published Aragon, and you can see that some people, some French exiles, wrote to Jacques Schiffrin saying, thank you for what you did, because you can help us to see that the spirit of resistance is not dead and that something is existing in Europe, and thank you Jacques Schiffrin for helping us to have access to this book. So I agree with your interpretation.
Yes, please.
As a linguist, the most interesting part of or one of the most interesting parts of the book, to me, was this entire idea that Schiffrin had of being a bridge between the cultures of Europe and the Americas, which is so important. And I didn't know, I hadn't realized until I read the book, that he was the first one to actually publish books in foreign languages in America. He published books in French, because it was such and in German, because it was such a large community, and there was a demand for it. Brentano's was the book.
He came before, I think. Brentano published before, right?
Well, Brentano,
It was the old Maison Française at the time.
yeah, the old,
Or the second
yeah.
sheet, they published.
But indeed, for instance, Camus, L'étranger, it was published by Schiffrin in French in the United States as L'étranger.
But this publication and this patronage of really political resistance writing, is that also in part an answer to this accusation of nostalgia? Because in Arendt as well, there is this is a persistent anxiety for her, right? On the one hand, there is of course the refusal of forgetting, because forgetting and the memory hold is the ultimate weapon of totalitarianism, because it neutralizes any reason for resistance, because if you're going to die in vain and not be remembered, why engage in resistance? So but on the other hand, she's also, you know, a powerful critic of nostalgia, as you see in Eichmann in Jerusalem, the central text of which is like an anti-nostalgic reading of the Holocaust, right? This is not the old story of the persecution of the Jews, this is something modern. And it seems to me that in some sense, that list of authors that you mentioned, this is not the nostalgic old canon that he's publicizing, right? This is political 1940s stuff.
Absolutely, Adam. But I think that Schiffrin's nostalgia began at the end of the war. During the war, he was still under shock, you know, and he was trying to build his life, publishing this book linked to this tragic history that was happening. But after the war, when all this was over, and I think when he realized all what happened, he began to have these very nostalgic feelings, and the fact that he just could not come back to France because it was too hard. So indeed, during the war, he was, in a way, it was very difficult for him, because when he arrived, he had just nothing. But, you know, he had to fight
He was a militant.
for building his life in the United States, and he also had, in his way, by publishing, to fight for the free world. So during the war, it was a peculiar period, but after the war, there was this nostalgia, this very deep nostalgia that he felt.
Another question. Yes, lady here in the beautiful star.
I'd like to connect two comments to ask a question. I knew André Gide 100 years ago. We had a fight in 1958 when we were students, before you were born, and we never made up. So I never spoke to him again. But my father was an economist, so I.
Keep in mind.
So the point is, I remember André always talking about that he was the only socialist at Yale, which was probably true since it was the Buckley period. But in his own autobiography, he writes about growing up in a family full of people discussing socialism and socialists. And the author here doesn't even mention that. What socialist groups were they affiliated with? The French socialists, or the Mensheviks, or the SRs, or even the cadets? He had a socialist background, and the reason I bring that up, I know a lot about Varian Fry, because I was the chief dance critic of the New York Times for many years, and Varian Fry and Lincoln Kirstein, founder of the New York City Ballet, were the editors of the avant-garde magazine Hound and Horn at Harvard. And Varian Fry was teaching English someplace really when he was recruited by what became the Emergency Rescue Committee. And here I would like to say, and tie this up with socialism, the role of the American labor unions in getting Varian Fry's people out was very important. William Green, head of the AFL, if you all remember what a labor union was, went personally to Roosevelt and submitted that list, and Eleanor Roosevelt was also involved. And so the point is, you can see all that material at the Robert Wagner Library at NYU, the Robert Wagner Labor Library. You can see those lists. So I am absolutely floored that Gide recommended him to the vice consul in Marseille, and he got the visa. The people who were on Varian Fry's lists, those lists were very meticulously put together. I don't understand how Gide could get him an American visa unless he brought up his socialist background. And I also want to say, I mean, really, I'm a great supporter of the Labour Party as it used to be. And it's called the Labour Party because it was the Socialist Party of the UK. at one time. And the thing is, how is it, well, all right, I'll stop.
Excellent, this is extraordinary. History emerging from the audience. So, on the question of the family's politics, we've got Anya here, who's also a witness, but do you want to have a go first, Amos, at like identifying the position?
Thank you very much for your point, and things that I didn't know, but I just can bring 2 points to the conversation. First, the letter sent by André Gide to Varian Fry, asking Varian Fry to help his very dear friend Jacques Schiffrin, is here, I think, at the Butler Library. And so in this letter, there is no reference to the socialism, communism, to the Labour
Well,
Party.
that's what I find strange, because the people, they weren't just intellectuals.
Yeah.
They were German socialists,
Yeah.
Austrian socialists,
We
French
do
socialists,
understand the
Russian
point.
socialists, Spanish republicans.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Clearly, they were also most endangered.
That's right.
Yeah, so it's interesting that this politics doesn't come up. Anna, you actually have a memory of the politics of the...
Yeah, I actually remember my dad being very socialist, and he's written extensively on his experiences at Yale, but I don't remember him really talking about my grandparents' politics, except maybe I think they may have been cadets.
His mother said she was a Jacobin.
Yes, that's thank you. My mom's reminding me that at one point my dad asked my grandmother, "What religion are we?" And she said, "We're Jacobin, darling."
That might be the line of the evening, to be honest.
Much more memory than I do. But the other thing I wanted to mention was that weren't there two lists? There were a union list, there were labor leaders that
It was
were,
called
and
the
Varian.
labor list, but it included the socialist leaders of
But
Europe.
two things. One is Varian Fry in those early meetings said they divvied it up, and Varian Fry said, "I'll take the artists and the intellectuals." The labor people were taken out by somebody else.
Right.
And second thing, which Amos probably would point out, is remember Gide brought my grandfather to Russia to translate for him, and wrote the book Return to USSR about how terrible the communists were. So they were definitely anti-communist. Beyond that, I wish I knew more. I never met my grandfather. My dad didn't even know about this book, so I'm sorry.
But you murmured cadet.
That's my memory, but that's a little kid memory, so it could be totally wrong.
So that would make them liberal rebels.
That's
Yeah.
my memory.
Well, I certainly don't remember Andre talking about his father being very political.
All I remember is cadet and Berenson.
Yeah.
This doesn't happen.
Sorry,
Most
but
pilots. This is fantastic. We have a question at the back there. Gentleman at the back.
Michael Wise.
Yes, I realized.
Speak up with the mic.
Yes. Can you talk a little bit about what acknowledgement Gallimard has made for what happened to Jacques Schiffrin? It's been a
Thank you. So the question is, what reparations or what apology Gallimard has made for this appalling letter, if any?
Yes, well, not really actually. At the end, at the end of the war, the brother of Gaston Gallimard, Raymond, wrote to Schiffrin saying, "Now maybe the war is over. We could get in touch again. If you want to come back, maybe we can think about it." And until the end of his life, and actually the last letter that I found written by Jacques Schiffrin, maybe 10 days before he died, was a letter asking for financial reparations. And I know that in the 70s, I think, André Schiffrin found a lawyer in Paris in order to end this story and to have this reparation. And I don't know if finally Gallimard gave money, but what I can say is that in the very recent years, notably by publishing the correspondence between Jacques Schiffrin and André Gide, where we can see obviously that Gallimard played a terrible part in Schiffrin's destiny. This was published by Gallimard, so very slightly this is a way.
But do I understand correctly that your book will be the first to expose this letter firing Jacques Schiffrin in this form?
It was exhibited
No,
at
it was in the exhibit at the New York Public Library.
Organized.
Andre-
We have it bronze.
But will there be a French edition of this book?
Well, that's,
Amos, will there be a French edition of this book?
I hope so. Now that I will have more time in France, I will work on it.
Another question Question at the back, gentleman with glasses.
Yeah, I have a question for Amos to go back to the initial statements, the paradox that you raised in your introduction, the world fame of the Pléiade edition, and the discrepancy between this world fame of this publishing house and Jacques Schiffrin's name, which is, as you said, quite confidential. How do you account for the fact that almost 70 years after Jacques Schiffrin's passing, his life story had never been told before? And can you say a few words about what, as a historian, what led you to this story?
Regarding the fact that his name remained confidential during so many years, maybe, you know, in France, we needed a lot of time in order to understand what happened during the Second World War. And your work, Professor Paxton, played a decisive role in it. However, I think that there are still some points, some fields that were not highlighted. And what happened to La Pléiade, and what did Gallimard, and Gallimard, which is very, very important in France, and of course they are publishing absolutely great books, but I think they didn't want this to be known. And for instance, in the biography of Gaston Gallimard, written by Pierre Assouline, which is very rich, very interesting, very vivid, there is not a word about this letter that you read. So I think this is one of those little points that remain very under the screen. And
Assouline mentioned that Jacques Schiffrin as the founder of the Pléiade.
yes, but I think that he is writing a line, one line, but maybe because he didn't know. I don't know. Maybe Professor.
I don't know the answer to the question. I think you're quite right. It was something they prefer not to talk about.
And in order to answer to the second part of your questions, when I came to New York, I wanted to work on French intellectuals in exile during World War II, and I began to be interested in Jacques Schiffrin's life, and I met Anya, and I wanted to have this information in a very special context of André's death, and so this played also a very important part in my work, because history, you said that it was something that I liked a lot, and indeed, but it's because also to pay tribute to the past, and there was something to do here very important, not only with Jacques, but also with someone that I didn't know, that I hadn't met, but who was very important as I understood it, and I still understand it tonight.
Another question, this gentleman here with the glasses.
Ieder de Haan, Utrecht University, and Columbia visiting professor at this department. I have a question that picks up with a remark by David Gilligan just in passing, namely that the people that were rescued were selected among the culturally and intellectual elite, also maybe a specific political group. To what extent was Schiffrin himself aware of the fact that he might belong to such a group, and that it might even be important for himself to continue a cultural legacy, to bring that, to keep that alive? And also, does it diminish, that's maybe a more normative question, but still, does it diminish the efforts in the rescue attempts of Vrij and others to select such a group of people?
Well, you know that there were different groups who tried to rescue people in distress. In Marseille, for instance, and there was a Rockefeller Institute, but that was helping mostly scholars. And Schiffrin was not a scholar. So I think it doesn't diminish. I mean, at one point, if you can find some help in those situations where it's a life or death situation, so it doesn't diminish anything.
If I could just add to that very quickly. Vrij probably saved about 2,000 people by rescuing them. There were about 5,000 on the boats just down to Martinique. So the 3,000 others, while not celebrities, did have one thing in common. they had enough contacts, wherewithal, dépouillardise, as the French would say, but also enough money to buy a ticket that was now 10 times more expensive than it had been 2 years earlier. So they are, in a sense, I mean, when I was researching these refugees, I came to realize that in some instances, a photographer was on one boat, and her 2 subjects were on 2 different boats. What this led me to conclude was they were part of a coterie of upper middle class people. Right? So there's no doubt about that. Does it diminish the fact? I don't think so. I don't think we can cast that particular judgment backwards.
David, is that a challenge that you face in the work of the committee today, this problem of selection in the end?
Not so much, because those who have the wherewithal pay their way out. I mean, think about Syrian refugees, the first to leave were those who had the ability to get out. Those who are quote-unquote resettled, who are part of an organised planned transfer to a third country, meet vulnerability criteria that the UN assesses. So widows, victims of torture, etc. And we base our work on sort of needs assessments, really, about who is in the greatest need and where are there other agencies not reaching. So we try and make it a virtue to go as far as possible into places where people are not able to get help. And obviously we don't charge for what we do. But there is, and people often say to me, well, you're running a $750 million organization, so where do you decide to put the money? And the truth is I don't sit there with $750 million deciding what to do. 78% of our grants now, of our funding, comes from government sources. And so the governments decide we want to fund a reading project in Pakistan or a nutrition project in Yemen, and then we apply and win the grant. It's worth pointing out that the 22% that comes from private donations comes from foundations and corporations, but it also comes from individuals. And we've managed in the last 5 years to double the percentage of our budget that comes from private individuals, as we've increased the size of the organisation from about $430 million to 750, and that reflects both the increasing scale of the need, secondly the growing consciousness of humanitarian crisis, but also something quite interesting. People often say to me, well, it must be hard to run a humanitarian agency when so many governments are in retreat from the core values that certainly Western countries traditionally should have been standing for. And the answer to that is yes, in a way, but we found that for every government that turns back, there's then a reaction of people who want to try and make a difference themselves. And having lived in New York for 5 years, I've lost any inhibitions about asking for money for people to charitable endeavours. So I'm looking forward to this being a very profitable evening.
There are leaflets by the door. Please pick them up. Do we have another question? Yes, the lady here.
Bernard Berenson, emeritus from Fordham University, anthropology. I'm curious about the relationship of Schiffrin with other, what you call the scholars, especially in Europe, especially Lévi-Strauss, whom I know particularly. He was my mentor and proctor. And I don't remember coming across the name of Schiffrin in his biography. So I wondered whether you would have seen any connection with Lévi-Strauss and his entourage. Lévi-Strauss was mixing up with artists, with Breton, with mathematicians, etc. What about Schiffrin?
Thank you very much for your question. Actually, maybe the biography you are referring to is the one of Emmanuel Loyer, who was the supervisor of my work. So we had the opportunity to discuss this issue, and indeed, surprisingly, or maybe not so surprisingly actually, they didn't meet, or maybe they had an opportunity to meet, but this is something that escaped from the archives. Maybe they saw each other at one moment, but they were not friends in New York. And this is maybe because Lévi-Strauss was, I think, a lot in the French circles. No, please.
No, because he was greatly involved at Columbia in particular.
Yeah.
With Franz Boas, with Margaret Mead, with all the American anthropologists. Actually, it's thanks to some of the American anthropologists he managed to get the support of Rockefeller to come over. and he was very involved in with mathematicians, Weil in particular, who wrote the appendix of the elementary, the elementary structure kinship. So he was mixing up. But one thing, you mentioned that Schiffrin was living on the west side, upper west side.
Yeah.
Lévi-Strauss was living in the village.
Why is that not surprising?
Well, just two things. Maybe one part, in order to answer your question, is that Lévi-Strauss was in mostly scholar circles, and Jacques Schiffrin was not really in relationship with scholars. And just regarding the location of Jacques Schiffrin in New York, first he was in a hotel in the Upper East during a week when he arrived, then on Riverside Drive, and finally, in order to help André to have a better school with what we would call in France the carte scolaire, that is to say the scholar school district, the family moved to the Upper East. But where Schiffrin felt the better and had decided to live was the Upper East, the Upper West, I'm sorry, on Riverside Drive.
But in Paris as well, he was not somebody who was mingling with an academic circle.
No.
So in a sense then, this is a story also of the fallacy of imagining that because people are displaced, or rather, certain sorts of refugees are thrown in a single big pot and end up mingling. But if you in fact manage to maintain a degree of status and network, then the social differences that prevailed in 1930s Paris continue to prevail in New York, right? So that kind of that resistance of identity is an important factor here. Do we have another question? Yes.
The rise of the anthropologists in this book. I'm Judith Friedlander, and I actually just finished a book on the history of the New School, and which of course has a big role in the intellectual life in New York at this time. And indeed, Lévi-Strauss was not only with scholars, but he was part of the École Libre des Hautes Études, which became part of the University in Exile project at the New School. And that was a very special world. And just in terms of languages, it is interesting that the French wanted to have a French francophone university, whereas the Germans were speaking in their fashion in English.
Yes.
So what arrondissement did...
Sorry, what arrondissement did Mr. Schiffrin when he was
in Paris, he was living on Rue de l'Université, just nearby the Assemblée Nationale, in an apartment that was renewed as a really astonishing apartment. I had the opportunity to meet a woman that knew Jacques Schiffrin, both in Paris and in New York, Svetlana Alexeyevs, that I met for my research, and she unfortunately died two years ago, maybe at the age of 91, so I also want to have a thought for her. But she remembered that the apartment in Paris was something magnificent, and in New York it was very, so something very sad. And I think that André in his memoir also says that when he compared the pictures of the apartment in Paris and what was his life in New York, there was such a gap. And so this is also part of the tragedy of exile, of being a refugee, because they had a status before.
So as a book person, the question, when you say it was a magnificent apartment, does that mean he had a big library?
Yes.
No, seriously, because so if you think about Benjamin, like one of the tragedies of exile is you lose your books, and you can't take them with you, like you're reduced to living out of a suitcase. And if you are a book person, that is one of the big problems with books, is they don't go in suitcases.
Absolutely. And Schiffrin said that the German took the 9/10 of his library.
Yes.
Just a little oddity about the books, that Jacques and Sion did have a whole lot of books, and they were rediscovered in boxes that the Germans had taken them
but they somehow had their names on it and they got them back.
So in your childhood, the books were present in New York?
Oh, yes.
Wow.
So there was we haven't heard very much about Simone at all in our discussion so far. I mean, when one looks online, she looks as though she was an astonishing character. She was one of Paris's most famous beauties.
Yes,
of the day.
Aragon or Malraux said that she was actually the most beautiful woman of Paris.
There must have been
But
more to
actually,
that.
what is more essential is that when they arrived in New York during 2 years, while Jacques Schiffrin was trying to find something to do, Simone worked. She was working in what we can call ornamental things that were dresses, and she was a very, very important figure, sending all these ornamental accessories. Thank you very much, Sandra. This is why it's wonderful to have such a But so she played a key part, because without her, during the 2 first years in New York, the Schiffrin would not have been able to leave. So
is that something she did in Paris before? Was she in the fashion industry in Paris in the 30s? Another question here, yes, from Laura.
I had a question about Varian Fry, because one of the things I've heard from people is very interesting to think about the plight of the refugee. But there's also the plight of somebody like Varian Fry, who, from what I understand, was largely repudiated by the U.S. for what he did, and lived in complete unknown for many years, had struggled with alcohol.
Became a high school teacher, didn't he? I think
Yeah,
a
he
boarding
had a
school
terrifying
teacher.
existence. Well, I had a question related. What was his relationship to Schiffrin? How did he actually enable him to escape? And second of all, did they continue to be in touch? And also, lastly, was Fry ever recognized during his lifetime for what he did, really, here or abroad?
Can I just say there was a mammoth exhibition about him at the Jewish Museum 10 years ago.
On a very, very shortly on the Schiffrin and Fry issue, and after I let the floor, they didn't get in touch after. I think that Schiffrin was a name on the list for Varian Fry, and so he helped him, but they were not in relationship. After why Varian Fry was unknown during all these years, I think.
One of the documents I remember from that show about Varian Fry at the Jewish Museum was a letter from the State Department to the American consul in Marseille, to the French authorities, urging them to get rid of Varian Fry. Varian Fry was not well regarded at the U.S. State Department.
But he was honoured by Yad Vashem as the first righteous amongst the peoples from America, right? He's, I think, the first American on the Yad Vashem walk.
Varian Fry was expelled from the State Department's support by Vichy because Pearl Harbor had not yet happened.
Yeah,
right. And the Americans were trying not to receive any more refugees.
He may have been expelled, but his organization kept going, and his right-hand man, Daniel Benedict, kept things happening.
Do we have one last question?
Thank you. I'm Ronnie Sharfman, Emerita Professor of French. I wanted to thank you for clarifying a point of literary history which may seem negligible to many, but was actually the reason that I became a French professor, and that is that on that boat in 1941 that Fry managed to get intellectuals onto, André Breton was one of them who stopped in Martinique and discovered by surrealist chance a relatively unknown poet named Aimé Césaire, whom he then published, I realize now from listening to you, through Brentanos in 1947. He published the first complete text of the Cahiers de Retour au Pays Natal, which actually became the basis for all of Francophone studies throughout the world. So I didn't realize that Schiffrin had played the role in making that happen.
It was not the same boat. It was
No, it wasn't the same boat. So this was the Wyoming, that was the Capitaine Paul Lemaire, but it's part of the same exile. So the Paul Lemaire actually crossed twice, the Wyoming actually crossed twice. crammed with refugees each time. And indeed, the one you're talking about had quite a cast on board because Lévi Strauss was on board, Anna Zegers was on board, Victor Serge was on board, and Il j'en passe.
Am I understanding correctly, though, that it was because of Brentano's in New York that Schiffrin helped Breton get this book published?
I mean, Schiffrin worked with Breton in New York, and so they were definitely in relationship, in a publishing relationship.
So I said it flippantly earlier, but I think as the conversation's gone on, I've come to feel it ever more intensely. It's extraordinarily unusual to have a session like this where so many people's personal history merges with the topic of the panel and so much bundled expertise and practical competence. It's really a very rare thing, and I think we owe both Amos and Sandra and the Schiffrin family a great debt for having enabled us to have this evening together, not to mention all the other panelists here. So please join me in thanking them for